Hi, welcome to Our Christ. Today I'm joined by Dr. Paul Ladouceur. Paul is an Orthodox theologian and a writer living in Quebec and Canada. He teaches theology and spirituality in the Orthodox Theology programs at Trinity College and the University of Toronto and at the Montreal Institute of Orthodox Theology. He's affiliated with the Université Laval. He's written and edited several excellent books and articles on orthodoxy, and we'll focus mainly on his brilliant book, Modern Orthodox Theology, today. So just then to begin with this book, Paul, can you tell us what brought it about and what do you hope that readers will then gain from it?
Well, thank you for taking the time to do this interview. I will enjoy speaking about my book. Well, what brought the book about basically was my teaching activity. As you mentioned in your introduction, I teach in Orthodox theology programs both in Toronto and in Montreal. And one of the courses that I've been giving for the past 10 years or so is on modern Orthodox theology. So in preparing for those courses, my course notes, after giving the course a number of times, I said, oh, I think this might be possible to turn into a full-scale book. So that was really the origin of it, were my course notes. But to go from course notes to a book is a lot of work. A professor speaking in front of the classroom can get away with a lot of stuff that you can't get away with when it's printed and sort of published. So it has to be a lot more precise, and of course with a lot more references and sort of detailed exposition of arguments. So it took a good 3 years from the time I first started working on the manuscript, and it kept growing and growing and growing to the final book. So what I hope readers will get out of the book is really to have an overview of the full range of Orthodox theology in modern times. Now, modern in an Orthodox context is a very fluid concept. For some Orthodox, anything after the 4th century can be considered modern, but more typically modern would be taken to be, for example, from the fall of Constantinople in 1453. That's not a usual definition of modern, but it really, that event inaugurated quite a change in the Orthodox ethos and history. So the modern here really covers the period actually just prior to that, just the century of the 14th century of St. Gregory Palamas is summarized, and then I really go on from the fall of Constantinople. But the focus of the book really is from the mid-19th century up to the present. That's the sort of hardcore of the book. So we're really covering a century and a half. So my aim was to give readers an overview of the richness of Orthodox theology during this period. Both in terms of the historical context and in terms of specific key issues. So that's what I hope that people will get out of the book. And then with numerous references, not only in the footnotes, but there's a very detailed bibliography divided by chapter, by sort of specific period in time or geographic area, or the issues that it's possible to follow up on specific themes that might be of interest to particular readers.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Paul. That's fantastic. And then I really found it most helpful and a wonderful complement in many ways to other fantastic books by Father Louth, who's written Modern Orthodox Thinkers, and famously Metropolitan Kallistos Ware's The Orthodox Church. So then how would you compare your book with some of those?
Well, first of all, talk about Metropolitan Kallistos Ware's book, The Orthodox Church. It is truly a modern classic of orthodoxy, first published in 1963. It's now in its third edition. It has two basic sections. First, a historical one, and then a second one dealing with different aspects of faith and worship. I consider it to be a kind of a one-book overview of orthodoxy, and it's hard to beat. There is nothing else like it. It contains admirable summaries of many aspects of the Orthodox tradition, both ancient and modern. So it really is said it's kind of a one-book encyclopedia presentation of orthodoxy. Father Andrew Louth's a book on modern Orthodox thinkers, as the title suggests, really focuses on individuals. And the chapters basically are this theologian and then another one and then another one. So it focuses on key modern theologians and spiritual figures. Again, there are excellent overviews of key aspects of the theologies of the individuals covered. But what is a little bit difficult in the book, and the book just isn't set up that way, it's difficult to see what broad trends are and interrelationships among the different theologians and the theologies that they represent. So my perspective was to look at modern Orthodox theology, again, as in Kallistos Ware's book, in two perspectives. The first one is more a historical perspective, but here I don't start from day one as he does. As I said, I focus on the modern period with a sort of a very quick overview of the period from the 15th to the mid-19th century, and then focusing, as I said, especially on the mid-19th century to the present. So here I look at, yes, individual personalities, but in their geographic and historical contexts, rather than sort of detached. And then in part two, I looked at specific themes and conflicts in modern Orthodox theology, focusing on 8 issues that, in my opinion, are the key issues that arose in modern times in Orthodoxy, and focusing very much on, in effect, interaction or conflict among theologians, among ideas, because Orthodox theology is not limited to sort of a one-track kind of thing. There's a very broad range of approaches, and sometimes there is overt conflict among theologians. Sometimes it's more subtle. So I've tried to focus on said themes and conflicts to show the sort of broad range of Orthodox thinking on a wide range of issues. And then the final part of the book, called Assessments and Conclusions, said is an attempt to sort of draw things together and to highlight what are, in effect, contemporary trends in Orthodox thinking. So the book doesn't hide warts. There are problems in Orthodox theology, but what I try to do is to draw out the thinking of the individuals, set in their historical and in some cases even social context, and to relate these both to earlier patristic thinking and to the thinking of other Orthodox theologians in the contemporary scene.
Thank you so much, Paul. That's fantastic. And then if we might move to one of those, then I want to ask you a little bit about the Russian religious Renaissance then, and what was central to the Russian religious Renaissance and the new religious consciousness, as you described.
Well, I'll discuss those themes sequentially, one after another, although I'll draw what the relationship is between them. The Russian religious Renaissance was a very broad philosophical and theological and even literary and cultural movement in late imperial Russia, roughly from the mid-19th century up to the Russian Revolution in 1917. And in fact, one can certainly trace the origins of modern Orthodox theology to a group of Russian thinkers called the Slavophiles in the mid-19th century. They were really the first to come up with notions and approaches to theology which really marked the modern age, sort of breaking with more traditional approaches to theology that had preceded them. So the Russian religious Renaissance was a bit later than, it was really towards the end of the 19th century, and again up to the Russian Revolution. After the revolution, it was not possible to carry on within the Soviet Union itself, and most of the key personalities then moved to the West, particularly to France. So what the Russian Revolution, Russian religious Renaissance was essentially a Christian response to non-Christian and even anti-Christian philosophies, notably Marxism, which were then popular among the Russian intelligentsia. And they revolved around the central issue of what is the future of Russia? Because the imperial system, clearly by the end of the 19th century in Russia, was decaying. It was outmoded as an aristocratic, autocratic system. And it needed to modernize for Russia to survive. So that was the key question. What is the future of Russia? So the Russian religious Renaissance was marked not only in theology and philosophy, but also in literature, in poetry, in culture in general. And it became known in the world of letters, of literature, as the Silver Age of Russian culture. I said up to the Russian Revolution. What was perhaps very striking about the Russian religious Renaissance is that almost all of the leaders of this movement were not clergy, but they were laypersons who were concerned about Christianity, the future of Christianity in Russia in particular, but also about how the church should adapt to the modern world. The official Russian Orthodox Church at the time was greatly bound up with the Russian monarchy and with the entire imperial system. And it was really incapable of responding to the intellectual and social ferment in Russian society at the time. So what you refer to as the new religious consciousness was really kind of a subgroup within the broader movement of this religious Renaissance. And it was composed of persons who were perhaps the most distant from historical orthodoxy. Yes, they were mostly Christian, but also attracted by Oriental religions, especially Hinduism and Buddhism, and also inclined towards various forms of esotericism, esoteric forms of religion. So they are within the movement, but sort of a little bit on the fringes in comparison with the main philosophers and theologians who were decidedly Christian and Orthodox. This movement, the new religious consciousness, was in effect a kind of a precursor of the late 20th century New Age movement. And in fact, some of the same religious leanings can be found among the members of the new religious consciousness and the New Age movement, particularly interest in Oriental religions and aspects of esoteric religious experiences and thought.
Thank you so much, Paul. And then if we might move next to another fascinating emphasis in your book and within the history is on Sophia. So I want to ask you a little bit about what is Sophia. I know there's a reluctance for many people to define Sophia, broadly speaking then, and why does it, and did it spark such controversy then?
Well, yes, your reference to controversies is certainly correct, because certainly I consider, and I think most Orthodox would consider, that the controversy over Sophia or divine wisdom is the most important area of conflict in modern Orthodox thought, encompassing both philosophy and theology. So briefly, stated, though, Sophia is the theology of divine wisdom, also referred to as Sociology. The essential idea of divine wisdom is to try to describe how God exists in relation to the world, how God reveals himself or manifests himself in creation. So it's really the age-old problem of how God can relate to something that is not God, outside himself, out of creation. So Sociology then attempts to unite God and creation in a single philosophical theological vision, rather than a more traditional approach of seeing an absolute difference or an impassable gulf between God on one hand and creation on the other hand. In Orthodoxy, Sociology has its origins in the thinking of the late 19th century Russian philosopher Vladimir Soloviev. He was the first to popularize the notion of Sophia, which he actually got himself from German philosophy. And then the idea was then picked up and expanded upon by some of his followers, especially Father Pavel Florovsky, and in particular, Father Sergius Bulgakov. Sergius Bulgakov was unquestionably the greatest Orthodox theologian of the first half of the 20th century. And I say that quite deliberately. And I think later on in the interview, we'll come back to the discussion of why I say he was the greatest Orthodox theologian of the first half of the 20th century. So Bulgakov developed Sophia, or divine wisdom, into an all-encompassing theological perspective, which raised many problems. There are two basic ones that critics focus on who look at this philosophy. The first is that early versions of Sociology, particularly in Soloviev and Father Pavel Florovsky, is that there was a tendency to treat divine wisdom as though it was a sort of fourth divine person after the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Now, clearly this notion of a fourth divine person is unacceptable in Christian theology, not only Orthodox theology, but Christian theology in general. So that kind of language, even if it was not fully spelled out, Sergius Bulgakov in particular realized that this was highly problematic, and he was quite clear to sort of extract and delete this entirely from his thinking on divine Sophia. Even though at times when we read about divine Sophia, it's not clear whether it's a personal principle or some kind of abstract notion. So the second line of critique, according to those who don't like this approach at all, is that the theology of divine wisdom, or Sociology, tends to blur, if not eradicate, the distinction between God and creation. And this opens the door to some kind of pantheism, considering that the world or the cosmos itself is divine. And going further in pantheism, that God has no existence outside the world, outside the cosmos. Now, none of the Orthodox exponents ever went that far, but the critics felt that this kind of blurring of the distinction between God and the world opens the door to pantheism. Bulgakov himself was very well aware of this criticism and explicitly denied that his thinking was pantheism. He used the term panentheism. Now, he didn't invent the term. It's a philosophical notion that in effect says God and in the world, or the world in God. And the whole question then resolves on what does the word in mean? But basically for Bulgakov and others who explicitly adhere to panentheism, this philosophical approach transposed into Orthodox theology maintains the distinction between God and the world, but at the same time indicates that there is a very close interrelationship, and that's the notion of the in, panentheism. So it's the Greek word en for in. So this is how one of the ways in which Bulgakov defended himself against his critiques. Now, recent decades, well, just to go back a little bit, I won't go into this in too much detail, but this whole controversy blew up in the mid-1930s when Bulgakov in particular was criticized by various factions within the Russian Orthodox Church community in exile for, I said, the reasons that I said. And so there was a whole sort of back and forth, and in the end, his own jurisdiction, Orthodox Church jurisdiction, decided that his teaching was not heretical, but he was asked not actually to teach this at the St. Sergius Institute in Paris, the Orthodox Theological Institute, where he was a professor of dogmatic theology. So recent decades have witnessed a growing interest in the theology of Bulgakov, despite its complexity, because it's possible to sort of look at the sophiology controversy as sort of one aspect, but then sort of look at the depth of his theology across a very broad range of issues. And personally, I think, yes, he was certainly the most influential and powerful Orthodox theologian of the first half of the 20th century, but overall, he was probably the most profound Orthodox theologian of modern times. Perhaps not the most influential, we'll come to that in subsequent questions, but the most profound. And I think this is what is being discovered today as a result of the translation into English of his writings, because he wrote exclusively in Russian. And it's only in the last 2 decades that his major works and a lot of his minor works as well have been published in English translation. And this has sort of broadened the audience, obviously, beyond the specialists who could read the Russian, well beyond Orthodoxy. And there's a lot of interest in Bulgakov in Catholic and Protestant and Anglican circles now, much more than would have been the case 2 or 3 decades ago.
Thank you, Paul. And then as you sort of hint at there are these other strands which were incredibly influential, and I would love to look at some of those. And so could you tell us a little bit about, say, Neopatristic theology and Palamite theology as they've come down to us then?
Well, I kind of set the scene a little bit there when I was talking about the Russian religious renaissance and the discussion we just had on Sociology. The Neopatristic theology arose in the mid-20th century, so it was sort of historically, chronologically followed on the early part of the Russian religious renaissance. And it really was a reaction to 2 different types of theology, which were then dominant in Orthodoxy. The first was, and I haven't mentioned this so far, but perhaps I hinted at it a little bit. The first was a very rigid formal theology known as school or academic theology. This was the type of theology that was taught in seminaries and university faculties of theology in Orthodox countries. It was a type of theology very much influenced by Western scholastic theology in terms of its structure and even the themes that it considered, and in some cases opened the door to the introduction of Western theological notions into Orthodoxy. So that was sort of one type of theology, very dominant, as I said, in the theological educational systems in Orthodox countries such as Russia, Greece, Romania, Serbia, etc. The second type of theology that Neopatristic theology was developed in reaction to was what we've just been discussing, the very speculative theology characteristic of the Russian religious Renaissance, which on the one hand had the objective of trying to make Orthodox theology more relevant to modern problems, but on the other hand, in the eyes of its critics, was straying too far from the wellsprings of Orthodox tradition and thought. So what Neopatristic theology set out to do was to return Orthodox theology to its principal sources, being mainly Scripture and the early fathers of the Church, and hence the patristic in the name given to this approach to theology. The most vocal exponent of Neopatristic theology was Father George Florovsky, who preferred to refer to his theological approach as Neopatristic synthesis. My own preference is for Neopatristic theology because there are problems with the idea of a synthesis. It's actually a concept that comes from Greek thought and Hegel. Another very well-known early leading representative of Neopatristic theology was Vladimir Lossky, exemplified especially in his well-known book, The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. So the Florovsky and Lossky and their successors really dominated Orthodox theology in the second half of the 20th century and well into the early 20th century, with this sort of return to the fathers in particular as a basic source and inspiration for Orthodox theology. So Palamite theology that you mentioned, the sort of modern version of Palamite theology is usually referred to as Neopalamism, was really a part of this return to the fathers, but followed a slightly separate track or development of its own. Neopalamism entailed a return to the theology elaborated by St. Gregory Palamas in the 14th century concerning the divine energies, and in particular the distinction between the divine essence and the divine energies. So in this theology of St. Gregory Palamas, who was basing himself on earlier patristic thinking, particularly the Cappadocian fathers of the 4th century, God in himself, or the divine essence in sort of technical, philosophical, and theological terms, is beyond human comprehension. The divine essence is unknowable. This is actually a theme which occurs explicitly in prayers of the Divine Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom. Most people don't recognize this, but this aspect of the unknowability, or the apophatic, to use the technical term, nature of divine existence, so it does occur in some of the prayers of the Divine Liturgy. So you have the divine essence, and then on the other hand, God makes himself known or reveals himself or manifests himself in creation through the divine energies, which are God's presence in creation. And this presence takes two basic forms. One is referred to as natural revelation, God's presence in creation, in nature, and more explicit revelation as we know it, God revealing himself through sacred writers, as contained in Scripture, in the Bible as we know it. So it's possible then for humans to know and experience God through God's energies, but not his essence. And this sort of a sideline here is actually the basis for Orthodox spirituality. So the Orthodox Church actually approved this theology of St. Gregory Palamas in the 14th century, but the theology became obscured and in effect lost in the Orthodox tradition after the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453. One of the reasons that it kind of vanished from the Orthodox thinking and for a number of centuries was because this theology does not feature in Western theology. And in fact, Western theologians, particularly Catholics, were prone to criticize this theology of St. Gregory Palamas and even to consider that the theology was heretical. So it kind of vanished. But beginning in the late 1920s, among Orthodox theologians in the West, there was a movement to restore Palamite theology to its rightful place in Orthodox thought. And sort of looking at this now, nearly a century later, this movement was largely successful within the context of the overall context of Neopatristic theology, as we discussed a little bit earlier. So Palamite theology can be seen as, in effect, a more patristically based theology, addressing the same problems that we were discussing earlier as divine wisdom, how God relates to the world. And this is the reason that I examined these approaches to God and creation, the title of chapter 9 in my book. I discussed these and several other approaches, modern approaches to God and creation in a single thematic chapter, because they are very closely interrelated. They're dealing with the same problematic, but with different ideas and different words and sometimes different historical foundations.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. And then another wonderful element of your work that I found most insightful was how you show how these ideas have trickled down, as it were, if I'm going to put it that way, so that there's good versions of a neopatristic synthesis theology and bad versions, and you look at more open approaches like Metropolitan Kallistos Ware, who we mentioned, and then more closed fundamentalist type understanding. So I wanted to ask you a bit about that restoration of patristic thought, what it has looked like, what it could look like, or what it maybe should look like even.
Yes, well, this is really the sort of key theme of Orthodox theology in the second half of the 20th century and up to the present time. And here we really have to look to Father George Florovsky, because he made this sort of his campaign, his theological campaign, if you want to put it that way, from about the mid-1930s onwards. And he was really the only one who tried to explain methodologically what he was doing. He wasn't always successful. In particular, he coined the expression the patristic mind. Florovsky advocated following the fathers, but at the same time, he was very conscious of the risk of simply repeating what the fathers said. The fathers wrote many centuries ago in the social and economic and theological context of their times. And it's not always evident how to relate that to our contemporary situation, which is so different in terms of society and culture and what have you. So Florovsky considered that it was necessary to address modern problems, but inspired by the thinking of the early fathers. And this is what he referred to as acquiring the patristic mind. Now, he never really defined what he meant by this. But if we go through his writings carefully, we can identify a number of key elements that constitute the patristic mind as Florovsky saw it. Some of these elements, I have to say, are controversial, but they are a part of his thinking on what constitutes the patristic mind. The first is the scripture as the foundation of all theology. So fairly evident, but some tendency in some branches of theology to place more emphasis on philosophical foundations. But Florovsky was very keen, as the fathers were, to ground all theology in scripture. The second important principle, in effect flowing from this, is that Christ is the center of theological reflection. Father George Florovsky is known for a very strong Christological focus and concentration in his writing. So all theology has to relate to Christ, to the incarnation, to Christ's teachings, to passion, death, resurrection. A third principle is a very strong historical awareness. This is both history in the sense of the history of salvation, as revealed in Scripture, in the Old Testament and in the New Testament, and the history of the Church. In his studies in university, Florovsky was very strongly oriented towards history, so he has this historical mind. A fourth principle is we call a Catholic consciousness. Now here, Catholic is used in the Greek sense, Katholikos, meaning not referring to the Roman Catholic Church at all, but referring to the universality of Christian teaching. So it's this sort of universal notion that a theology has to encompass all of existence, and this is reflected in Christian theology. So this is what he meant by a Catholic consciousness, and more specifically, doing theology in the context of the church, not sort of as a sort of outside independent discipline. A fifth principle, and this is probably the most controversial one, is fidelity to the Hellenistic Byzantine theological tradition. For Florovsky, theology was expressed in Greek by the ancient Greek fathers. And he had little to say and attached little importance to other sources within Christianity, even early Christianity, whether it be Syriac or in more modern times Russian theology or what have you. For him, theology was basically Greek. And when it was pointed out to him that one of his favorite patristic authors was in fact St. Augustine, and I think this took him aback, and it's quite true. When he reads Florovsky, he quotes Augustine a lot, probably more than any other individual father. And his answer was, well, Augustine was basically a Greek father. So I said, this is probably the one that has caused the most difficulty to Florovsky's critics, because he has critics, because it seems to limit theology to, I said, the Hellenistic Byzantine theological tradition, and not take adequate account of other strands, Coptic, Syriac, Armenian, and even modern theology. A sixth, which I mentioned earlier, is a focus on contemporary issues and problems, not sort of always dealing with the issues of the 4th century or the 5th century or the 6th century. And the final aspect is the integration of theology with the prayer and sacramental life of the church. Florovsky would point out that the fathers were holy men of old. They were not simply theologians in the modern academic sense. And this is very much in the Orthodox tradition, that theology is first and foremost the experience of God. It's not reflection or thinking about God, it's the experience of God. Because of the structure of universities and academic disciplines and what have you, we tend to think of theology as the study of God, but in the ancient church, it wasn't. It was the experience of God. And hence we have St. John the theologian, known for his deep experience of God, but also his profound reflections based on his experience of God.
Thank you. That's most important. Thank you, Paul. And with all that in mind, then, as here we are in the internet age, as it were, and there is that tendency to make things abstract, and we sort of live these abstract lives as avatars and screens and everything like that. I wanted to ask then, in light of all that, how might one then acquire a more patristic mind?
Well, I mean, I think I've outlined the sort of elements of that go into that. I think in terms of sort of the practical acquisition of this kind of reflection is really to read the fathers. There are much of the patristic works, particularly the Greek fathers of the church, are available in good translations now. In English, which is not always the case. Up until the late 19th century, there was hardly any patristic literature, whether Latin or Greek, available in modern Western languages. So it was necessary to read the actual Latin or Greek, which limited the scope of who could have access to these writings, but it was assumed that any literate person up to the early 20th century and even up to the middle of the 20th century would be able to read Latin and Greek. Well, the first English translations of the fathers were made available in the late 19th century. In English translations, which today are very stilted. The language is extremely formal, and sometimes it's even hard to follow the thinking because the presentation of the ideas, because the language is so formal. It's really sort of high level philosophical, theological language of the Victorian era. But fortunately, in the last 50 years, many of the major works have now been retranslated into more readable English. And I would recommend, for example, the series of works published by St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary Press, known as the Popular Patristic series. I think there are at least 50 or 60 of these, and there are still more coming out every year. These are very approachable, very readable translations that cover the most important patristic works. So my suggestion would be to read those, but also to read some of the great classics of Neopatristic theology, to sort of see what it looks like in particular. And what I recommend the most is actually the book I mentioned earlier, Vladimir Lasky's The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. This is certainly a great classic of a modern Orthodox theology. To me, it is the most important single book of Orthodox theology in modern times. It's not easy reading, it's very dense, but anybody tackling it, I suggest think that you will need to go through it several times to grasp it, because he does sort of cover the waterfront, a lot of patristic citations and references, and he deals with issues in depth. But it's very short. It's only a couple of hundred pages. But that would certainly be a very good approach to looking at, instead, one of the great classics, in fact, the greatest classic, I think, of modern Orthodox theology.
Excellent, thank you, Paul. And then I think Jonathan Pageau often ends up saying they actually go to church, and actually we often talk about reading so much that we forget to actually go to the liturgy, which is obviously true.
Well, this is in the context of slightly different context.
Oh, yes.
It's the context here is somebody who wants to know about orthodoxy. Now, our previous discussion was really sort of on how does one acquire the patristic mind. Well, that's already sort of an opening, but what is the best way to learn about orthodoxy? And here I would agree with Jonathan Pageau. Yes, go to a liturgy, and this is not new. This has been said for a long time. In fact, the first experience of this, the first recorded historical experience, goes back to the 10th century, if you can believe it, when the then Tsar of Russia, Russia at that time, of course, was pagan. This was prior to Christianity. He sent emissaries to the West, including what was then the Byzantine Empire, to learn about what the religious beliefs were. And when the emissaries reached Constantinople, they attended the liturgy in Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Divine Wisdom, by the way, and were so impressed with what they saw is that they wrote in their report, we would call it a report today, that it seemed as if they were already in paradise, in heaven. The liturgy was so beautiful and solemn and everything. So that was their first experience, and they recommended, in effect, that the Tsar and his people adopt Orthodox Christianity as the religion of the Russian people, and that was actually the origin of Christianity in Russian. To give a more modern experience, sorry for going on a little bit on this, the modern Orthodox theologian Elizabeth Bersigel. So she was a French theologian, initially a Protestant, Lutheran, and actually became initially trained in Protestant theology in Strasbourg in France. And in the Faculty of Theology, where she was a student, there were a few Orthodox, Russian Orthodox there, who had been given scholarships. And they invited her to go to Paris to attend the Paschal liturgy, the Easter liturgy, in the St. Sergius Church, where, guess who? Father Sergius Bulgakov was the priest. And so she went along, and that was her introduction, apart from casual discussions with the Russian students. That was her introduction to Orthodoxy, was attending the Paschal liturgy. And she was so impressed that she pursued, and within a year or so, asked to be received into the Orthodox Church. So that's another example of, experiencing Orthodoxy. Go to the liturgy.
Glory to God. Thank you, Paul. Sorry. No, that's brilliant. Another thing that Jonathan Pageau mentions, which I think is fantastic, going back to people like St. Maximus the Confessor, is the importance of the logi of things. So I want to ask you a little bit about that, if you might, Paul. So what's the importance of the logi of things, and how might we contemplate God then in creation without making it an idol, sort of building upon what you're saying previously?
Yeah, this very much flows on to what I was talking about earlier about how God relates to creation and palimism, the essence energies distinction. So the expression, the logoi, now there's a little bit of Greek here. Logoi is the plural of logos. So logos is a kind of a bit of a universal Greek word that can have many different meanings. Its essential meaning can be a word, an idea, a thought. We also use it in a Christian context to refer to the second person of the Holy Trinity, the Logos of God. And this comes from, of course, the the Gospel of St. John, where he refers in the beginning was the Logos. which he picked up from Greek philosophy. So the logoi of things, as you point out, is associated mainly with St. Maximus the Confessor in the 6th century. Maximus taught that all things are infused with a divine principle, which corresponds with God's presence and intention for that thing. So in this way, he was able to connect creation with their logoi to the divine logos, the second person of the Holy Trinity, through whom God created the universe. So the logos, or the logoi of things, draw things to achieve their divinely ordained purpose. And Christ, as the logos of God, is both the source of the logoi of things and their ultimate fulfillment in a kind of a cosmic theosis. So the universe is thus imbued with the divine presence. So the logoi are not something that a biologist or a geologist or an astronomer would discover, but they are rather the spiritual sense of creation originating in God, God's intention for created things and the goal to which they strive. So just sort of go on a little bit then, sort of how does this relate to how we view nature, and how does this relate to, in effect, a theology of nature? So between the two notions that I've discussed, and first historically that of the theology of St. Maximus the Confessor with the logoi of things related to the divine logos, and St. Gregory Palamas, the distinction between the divine essence, unknowable, and the divine energies by which God makes himself known in creation and through which we can experience God. These provide a very solid foundation for a robust theology of creation. So theology then, creation then is not something that's out there that is given to humanity to use or misuse in modern times, most frequently, but is rather a divine offering to humanity, which we can then return to God. So we can see God's handiwork, his presence in creation, with the responsibility of caring and tending for creation, just as Adam was called upon to care for the Garden of Eden. We tend to sort of forget that aspect, but stuck away there in the Genesis account of Eden is God's command that Adam should care for the garden. So in this sort of cosmic vision, all of creation can then be a theophany. A theophany is a divine manifestation. And it should be an occasion for elevating our thoughts and our prayers to God. This is a spiritual movement that Metropolitan Kallistos Ware characterizes as through creation to the Creator. Through creation to the Creator. And this, in fact, is the title of a well-known essay of his on an Orthodox vision of creation, and is the foundation, in effect, for Orthodox action concerning the environment and creation care, which is a very major theme of Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, and for which he is known as the Green Patriarch, in fact.
Thank you so much, Paul. And I think you've answered my next question there. So if I was going to ask you about how did this and returning to Sophia and the wisdom of God and divine energies and so on help us to return to this more sensible appreciation of God's creation, especially at this time whenever we do see such ecological destruction and even ignorance of the rhythms of nature and of liturgical rhythms and our place in the cosmos. Is there any more of the practical application that you'd like to add to that? Because you did such a good job there.
Well, no, as I said, I think the theological foundation there is very solid. And in fact, in this area, theologians and ecologists from other Christian denominations will often look to orthodoxy for the kind of theological foundation, religious foundation for environmental action. Now, I have to say that the theory is there, but orthodoxy itself has not always been so great at actually implementing that. Even in countries of Orthodox tradition, it is a very subtle theology, but it's a very sound one. So I think there is a bit of a gap there to fill between a theology that is very good and very profound and the actual implementation of what that means in practice, and particularly in terms of when it comes to legislation and actual actions to care for the environment. And we're sort of seeing this kind of debate today in society.
Thank you for that, Paul. And then what I think is most important about orthodoxy in your work is the balance between that cosmic vision and emphasis on persons and how they interrelate. So I just want to ask you as penultimate question, so what does an orthodox understanding of personhood really sound like then? And what are some of the limitations maybe of personalist theology as it's developed then?
Well, this is really going into what is probably the second most important theme in modern Orthodox theology, which is the theology of the human person. Again, its origins can be found in the Russian religious Renaissance, when the Christian philosophers and theologians in late imperial Russia were reacting to the impersonalist philosophies of the 19th century. These philosophies sought to denigrate the value of individual human existence, and instead elevated particular aspects of human existence to be the sort of supreme values. In particular, this is evident in Marxism, where social class and economic relations were considered to be the supreme values for humanity and the basis for, in effect, the restructuring of society. This is part of the debate on what is the future of Russia and its ultimate resolution in the Russian Revolution and the installation of communism. So the 20th century, in effect, saw this kind of thinking carried to great excess, especially, as I said, in communism in the Soviet Union and in the communist bloc countries of Eastern Europe after World War II, but also a slightly different perspective in Nazism in Germany, with all of the horrible consequences that we know. So the individual person in both cases is really of no value. Only on the one hand, only the social and economic relations and classes are important. And on the other hand, in Nazism, only ethnic affiliation, being German or non-German, is important. Everything else, that other characteristics that a human might have, are becoming irrelevant. So these and other related ideologies take a very partial or limited view of human existence. So the Christian thinkers of the Russian religious Renaissance and their successors in Neopatristic theology reacted to this type of thinking by stressing the value of the human person. And here we have to sort of go back a little bit in the history of Christian thought. In ancient Christian thinking, the category of person was applied to the three divine persons of the Trinity as a way of reconciling or trying to grasp how God can be one and three at the same time. And this is one of really the foundation of Christianity is the Trinity, and Christ as a member of the Trinity and his incarnation. So it's really the foundation of Christianity. But God is one, and how can he be three? and yet still be one. So this was the basic sort of philosophical, theological problem of the early centuries of the church, was how to deal with these two notions that seemed to be contradictory. And in the 4th century, then thinking congealed to distinguish between the divine essence and the divine persons. So the divine essence, yes, is one. There is one God with one divine essence or nature, but there are 3 divine persons, each of whom is distinct from the other, is unique, and yet they are united with the other persons in a bond of mutual love. So the Orthodox personalists, beginning with the Russians, applied this framework from divine existence to human existence. So humans share the same divine essence, human essence or nature, but are many distinct and unique persons. So the category of person then was extended from divine existence to human existence. So in this case, this theology is derived from the more traditional theology of human existence, which is founded on the notion of a divine image. Well, this, of course, comes from Genesis account of creation of humanity, where it said that God created humans in a divine image and likeness. So the personalists considered that a key aspect of the divine image in humanity is this notion of existence as persons. As the Greek philosopher and theologian Christos Yannaras says, humans have a personal mode of existence, just as the Trinity does. And this is the sort of aspect of the divine image that is considered to be an important one, not the only one, but an important one, and the one that is most relevant for this particular debate. So from this notion, then, the personalists and their successors in modern times then argued that each person is unique and irreplaceable, and hence of infinite value. So this was a very strong affirmation against impersonalist philosophies and philosophies, as I said, such as Marxism or Nazism, which would take only one aspect of human existence and consider that was the most important one. So it was a Christian response based on patristic notions, but applying it in a modern context. And I think this was, as I mentioned earlier, this type of thinking began in the Russian religious Renaissance, but was carried forward into Neopatristic theology with a great deal of consistency. Now, it went a little bit further in Neopatristic theology, but the foundations are in the thinking of the Russian religious Renaissance. So there's a continuity there. I refer to it as the golden thread that one can trace through a number of key individuals who clearly learned from each other as time went on and picked up this notion and further developed it. It said it is one of the major, most important themes of contemporary Orthodox thought.
Marvelous. Thank you, Paul. And then just the last question today. Where can anyone listening or watching find out more about you and your work, just finally?
Well, I have lots of publications. We've been talking about my book. Here it is, Modern Orthodox Theology. So almost everything I've spoken about can be found in there, although in some areas my thinking, my research and writing has gone beyond what's in the book already. But there is also a website where a lot of my publications are available, particularly articles that have been published in recent years in various academic and non-academic journals. And this website is called academia.edu. That's academia, academia.edu. So if you want to find that, you enter academia.edu and just put my name, Paul Ladouceur, and you will find my page within this very vast website with my publications, and in fact, there's a full bibliography there as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul, and God bless you.
I'm going there. Nobody can stop me.